Looking back in retrospect, I think it's probably the case that this was due, at least in some part, due to the onset of perimenopause, although I didn't know it at the time. And that was one of the difficult parts of my journey, actually, was that I was one of the many women who didn't really know anything about perimenopause prior to being in it, and in fact was in it for quite a few years before I even realized that. Hi, everybody. My name is Julie, and it is my great privilege to have the opportunity to share with you today a bit about my personal journey with recurring UTIs. In doing so, I have three main hopes or goals. The first is that I really hope that what I have to say to you today will just help you to feel encouraged on your own journey. If you're someone who's struggling with recurring UTIs, or you're someone who's trying to help others who are doing so, to hear that there are others out there who have been fighting the good fight, and with some success as well. The second aim that I have is I'd like to share some info about the strategies that I personally have found helpful and not helpful in addressing my recurrent UTI problems. Um, I have to say, one of the things that was most frustrating for me as I have gone through this process is trying to find good information, and in particular, actionable information. There are many, many websites and forums and blog posts where you get sort of generalized information or generalized advice, or encouragement to keep going and don't give up hope and whatnot, but not specific things that you can do or try or ask your doctor about. And I had to spend just so many hours. I have no idea how many hours I spent digging deep into websites and forums and blogs and things in order to find specific suggestions that I could try out. So I hope to be able to make that a little bit less painful for others by sharing the resources that I've found. And the third thing is I'd really like to give back in some way to the Live UTI-free community, which has been itself a tremendous resource for me. And quite a few of the specific suggestions that I'll talk about today are the things that I tried along my own journey. Not all of which were successful, but some of which were, are things that I discovered through the Live UTI Free community. So props to Melissa and the team for that, and heartfelt thanks. Um, a bit of background info first about me. I am 48 years old and I live in Berlin, Germany. I did want to mention that I'm living in Germany because the experiences that I've had in my recurring UTI journey have been had here in Germany within the context of the German medical system, which of course is different than medical systems in other places. So the experiences that I'll talk about and the products and strategies that I'll talk about are perhaps in some cases unique to the German market. First, where did my UTI journey begin? I didn't really have any struggles with UTIs when I was younger. I think maybe once in my 20s and maybe once again in my 30s, I had a UTI. Both times, very simple affairs, cleared up with antibiotics and didn't come back. So I didn't really think much about it. I just thought, it's something that most women have once or twice in their life, and that was my once or twice. um, my recurring problems, however, started in my early 40s. And looking back in retrospect, I think it's probably the case that this was due, at least in some part, due to the onset of perimenopause, although I didn't know it at the time. And that was one of the difficult parts of my journey, actually, was that I was one of the many women who didn't really know anything about perimenopause prior to being in it, and in fact was in it for quite a few years before I even realized that. So I was very happy to see that the Live UTI Free community, a few months back, I can't remember exactly when, did a video specifically about the connection between perimenopause and UTIs, and raised the question whether recurring UTIs might in fact be one of the first signs of perimenopause. I think in my personal case, that was definitely so. At first, when these infections started, it was pretty much only in connection with sex. When I would have sex, I would get a UTI after sex within a day or two, usually. But gradually, they also became connected to other triggers, things like sitting for too long, wearing tight clothing like pantyhose, or staying in my workout clothes for too long after actually doing my workout. Things like using hot tubs or taking long hot baths, drinking alcohol, drinking caffeine or tea, other things with tea in them. It took me a couple of years of self observation to actually figure out the myriad triggers. And that in itself was a long process. And in retrospect, one of the most important things that I did was just really noticing, just taking note and writing down and keeping track and trying to find patterns. When do these things occur? In the beginning, I didn't really do that at all. I just went to my GP, and he gave me antibiotics, and I would get better. But as they continued to then come back again and again, eventually I realized this isn't sustainable, or it's not tenable. So I started paying a little bit closer attention to triggers. So that's the first tip that I have from my own journey, is that it can be really useful to try and understand what your triggers are. Um, my frequency became greater and greater over time, through my early 40s. And as I said, I just kept taking antibiotics each time. Um, the simple 1 day or 3 day antibiotic treatments that are available never worked for me. So I always had to do a harsher 10-day course of antibiotics. The bacteria tests that I got from my doctors always came back positive for E. coli. Nothing more specific than that, and no explanation as to why my immune system wasn't keeping E. coli in check, because it's a ubiquitous bacteria that we have in many different strains of it in many different places in our body. So there was no real explanation as to why it was happening. Um, After about a year, I tried seeking treatment from an OBGYN who prescribed twice weekly estrogen cream, which I tried for a couple of weeks but didn't really see an impact. And at the time, I didn't understand how that might be connected, so I just discontinued it. I continued to receive antibiotics for each new infection. And then I got to the point where I actually had 13 courses of 10-day antibiotics in 1 year. And I decided then to try a urologist who did additional bacterial testing, but didn't yield any new insights in terms of the bacterial cause of the infections. It did show, however, that the E. coli that was found in my samples was partially resistant to the type of antibiotics I had most often been prescribed, which suggests that maybe they weren't the most effective antibiotics to have been given. The urologist also recommended that I try a vaccine that's available here in Germany called Strovac. It's a series of 3 injections that's supposed to help prevent UTIs. And I did that. Um, and he also recommended that I take a different daily low dose antibiotic as a quote unquote preventive treatment. Um, and I was desperate to be rid of the infections, so I tried that. I was initially only supposed to be on it for 3 months, but once I went off it, the infections came back. So the doctor told me just to stay on it all the time, which I did for over a year. Um, I was concerned, however, of course, about the damage I was doing to my microbiome. So I started digging into the long term impact of this antibiotic and learned that there can actually be some very serious side effects from taking it for longer than 6 months. I read some heartbreaking stories online of women who had been in situations like mine and stayed on the drug too long and ended up with pulmonary fibrosis, a deadly and incurable condition, and other just horror stories. So that's when I made up my mind to find a non antibiotic solution, no matter what it takes. And as part of my research, I fortunately came across Live UTI-free. And Melissa's story gave me hope for the first time that there might be another way. So I dug into the materials there and came across other resources across the web and started trying out every possible non antibiotic strategy under the sun to try and get on top of this problem. I have to admit, when I first read Melissa's story, I was kind of skeptical. I remember in her story, it's been a long time since I read it, but I remember there was part of it where she talks about sort of in an offhand way, she mentions, of course, I did the easy things first. I completely went off alcohol. I completely went off sugar and, various different dietary changes. And I remember thinking at the time, huh? Why? Like, why would you need to completely change your diet to get on top of, just to not have bladder infections? I mean, I've lived my whole life with a relatively healthy diet that I have. I've always been healthy, fit, health conscious person. Um, I've never thought deeply specifically about my diet, but I ate, generally speaking, healthfully and was always a healthy weight and exercised a lot and was very active. So it seemed weird to me to even think about possibly changing my diet as a strategy for my bladder infections. It took me a long time to become open to that idea, but as I read more and more other resources as well, I started to understand the incredible interconnection between all of the various different microbiota of our bodies, the various different microbiomes that we have in our gut, in our urinary tract, in our vaginal system, in on our skin, just everywhere. And I really had never appreciated that before, and that was a really big part of my journey as well. Just internalizing that and kind of getting over the mental hurdle that I can just eat whatever I want and it doesn't matter because it's always worked for me in the past. And I think it also that was partially tied into the menopause thing because menopause changes a lot of things in your body, perimenopause, and things that maybe did work for you in the past don't work for you anymore, diet wise and other types of lifestyle choices. So that's when I really sort of buckled down and said, okay, I'm going to try all these experiments and just see what works and what doesn't for me. So I realized I needed a multi-pronged strategy because I had to get on top of the acute infection, figure out how to keep the infection from coming back, figure out how to be able to have sex without having infections, and generally speaking, just how to manage my life without everything revolving around UTIs. So, in terms of the acute infection part, I tried many things. Um, Many of which didn't work for me, especially a lot of things that you hear frequently about, like deminosa and cranberry juice and pelvic floor exercises, Kegels on that front, and also one vaccine called the Strovac vaccine that's available here in Germany. Those things did not work for me. What did end up working for me in the end was a combination of three things that were recommended respectively by my doctor and my osteopath, and also a traditional Chinese medicine practitioner whom I consulted along my journey. The first is something called L-methionine, which is available over the counter in Germany. It's a naturally occurring substance that essentially helps to acidify the urine to prevent bacteria from sticking to the bladder lining and the urethral lining. The other two supplements, one called Canifrin Uno and another called Angicine Anti-Infect. And these again are herbal supplements that simply help to their sort of natural antimicrobials. They're non-antibiotic, but they do help to cleanse and purge the urinary tract. In case you're wondering, I've given a cheat sheet to the Live UTI-free community administrators, and you can ask them for that, so you don't feel like you have to furiously write down everything I'm saying. You can just ask for that resource after the end of the video. In terms of then staying free of the infection once the acute phase had passed, there were again, after many trials and errors, a few things that ended up helping me in the end. The first one, which I still take every day, is called European Goldenrod. The second one is a combination of high dose cranberry and pumpkin seed extract. Here I will say that cranberry juice and regular cranberry pills had not worked for me, but this combination does seem to help me. I don't know exactly why. Maybe it's because the pumpkin seed has extra anti-inflammatory properties or something about the synergy of the two things together. But in any rate, that does work for me. The third thing was I did, at the recommendation of my urogynecologist, a vaccine series that's an oral vaccine that's available here in Germany called Eurovax. And this vaccine specifically formulated to help the body um, deal better with certain strains of E. coli. And it's an oral vaccine that you take for a period of days, and then on and off, on again, off again, over a course of months. It can also be repeated after a year or two if necessary. I found that it was useful to refresh that after about 2 years. And then last but not least, I was placed on bioidentical hormone replacement therapy by my doctor. And this is essentially a type of hormone replacement therapy where a compounding pharmacy manufactures hormone pills, which I take morning and evening, that are specifically formulated for my body's needs, as determined by blood tests, which my doctor initially did every 3 months and then later extended that out to every 6 months once I was at a good level. They just check every once in a while that I'm still where I need to be, since there's so much fluctuation during perimenopause. The next thing that I had to figure out was, how do I reduce urinary frequency? Because even after the really bad part of the acute infection had passed, I still just felt like I had to go too frequently. I remember going on vacation with my husband and having to find a toilet every 30 minutes. It was a real hassle. So I needed to figure out how to retrain my body to not expect to go that often. And I think as a result of living with chronic UTIs for so many years, I had really trained myself to go to the bathroom very often, and I needed to untrain that. So what worked for me on that front were a couple of things. One, I did a several week, I believe it was 10 weeks, um, training with an Emzella chair. This is an electromagnetic stimulation chair that you sit on, and it sends vibrations through your pelvic floor and causes a lot of contractions, which train your muscles much better than pelvic floor exercises can do on their own. The second thing was I had a series of 3 vaginal CO2 laser treatments done. This was done by a urogynecologist, and essentially they put a laser up your vagina, and the laser essentially burns a little bit. It sounds terrible, but you don't really feel it. It's not painful. Um, it burns a little bit of the vaginal lining, and that stimulates it to produce new collagen and new tissue, which makes it more resilient, as well as also having add-on effects to make the organs around it have better, more supportive tissue, connective tissue. That's once a month for 3 months. And then my daily yoga practice was also extremely helpful. I started doing yoga during the pandemic because my gym was closed, and it turned out to be extremely useful for calming my nervous system, for the meditative aspects of yoga that really allow you to observe what's going on in your body and use your breath, use your state of mind to help calm the symptoms and not panic and not feel like you need to run to the toilet more often than you do. All of those things combined were useful in me retraining my urinary frequency. Of course, how do I manage to have sex with my husband without getting urinary tract infections every time? And that was something that, again, I had to experiment with a lot of different products and methods. In the end, what has ended up working for us is we do shower before sex. Total intimacy killer, of course, but if it keeps me off antibiotics and keeps me healthy, then it's worth it. And my husband's been extremely supportive on that front and very understanding. The second thing is actually experimenting with different lubricants for intercourse, because most lubricants that I've found anyway tend to be quite runny and thin, and I don't know, maybe they're engineered for pleasure and not so much for protection of the vaginal wall. But I've found that a few brands that focus more on the thickness or the consistency of something like a petroleum jelly are much more effective for me in preventing excessive abrasion and thereby helping me not to cross contaminate with bacteria from one area then migrating into my urethra area. So thick, very thick lubrication. And again, showering and going to the toilet after sex, of course. And then the evening, in the evening before I go to sleep, if I have had sex that day, I will use a vaginal pH regulator. I use one called Replen's pH. And essentially, what that does is you insert it into your vagina. It's just a clear fluid that returns the pH level of your vagina to a normal level, because the vagina has its own pH level that's its standard norm and its happy place. And through sexual intercourse, that often gets altered quite significantly, especially if there's ejaculation involved. So returning that to normal as quickly as possible, for me, helps to prevent the proliferation and spread of unwanted bacteria. So that's kind of my sex practice or protocol. And then I still have kind of in my back pocket an emergency kit that I pull out if necessary. And I have had to use that a few times since overcoming my UTIs. When I've felt, slight tinges of something coming back, I will immediately implement my emergency protocol. For example, I had an incident where I was on vacation and we went to some hot springs, and probably not a good idea for someone who's prone to UTIs, which is a good lesson to learn, to sit in hot springs that other people have been sitting in. And then I had to use my emergency protocol. Or another situation where I spent a really long time probably wearing slightly too tight clothing on an airplane, like 12 hours. And that also caused me to start having some noticeable symptoms. And in that case, I go back to the initial acute kit that I used in the beginning. I take the Canaphrin Uno, the Angicine anti-infect, and the L-methionine for 2 to 3 days, until I'm at least a day after, any kind of feeling of symptoms being there. And that has worked so far at keeping me from relapsing into a full-blown UTI. So this regime has, knock on wood, kept me UTI-free for a good long while now. I don't know, I can't remember exactly how long, but it's probably been at least 3 years. And that's just amazing, an amazing improvement in my quality of life. So those are the tips and tricks that I have to share. I hope that hearing about my story gives you hope for your own and encourages you to keep trying, keep going, and to know that that there can be light at the end of the tunnel. It's incredibly helpful to know that, and however long it takes that long. But I wish you all the best for your journey. And if you would like information about the specific strategies that I mentioned, the products that I mentioned, feel free to reach out to the Live UTI-free team. I provided them with a document that lists everything that I've mentioned in this video, so you don't have to frantically write everything down while listening to me. Anyway, all the best to you. And thanks very much for being part of this community, which has been such a huge help and blessing to me. Take care. Bye.
Hi, I'm Jenka from Love. I hope you found this video helpful. There's no single approach that will work for everyone when it comes to health, so I invite you to watch more patient videos here or read more stories over on our website, liveutifree.com, and take what resonates with your journey. Remember, it's always best to consult with a clinician before trying something new. If you'd like to share your own story, please get in touch. Our info is in the description. And feel free to reach out with any question about patient stories, finding a clinician, or your own personal experience. Also check out the description below for more helpful resources. If you find these videos valuable and would like to support what we do, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell button to stay updated when we post new content. Thanks so much for watching and for being part of this community, and remember, your story matters.